Okay, so we're going to dive into this 70-year-old document. And believe me, it is so much more than just old paper. This thing, it's the reason one of the planet's most dangerous borders even exists. And it's also why a massive global conflict, well, technically, it's still going on. I know, it sounds kind of crazy, right? But that is the actual reality on the Korean Peninsula. See, the Korean War, it wasn't won, it wasn't lost either. It was just paused. And that pause, yeah, it's been on for more than 7 decades now. So let's get into what that really means. Now, to be super clear, the actual fighting, the brutal, awful combat that defined the Korean War, that did stop. That happened way back in the summer of 1953. But, and this is the key, there's a world of difference between just stopping the shooting and actually signing a peace treaty that says, okay, this war is officially over. It's like hitting the pause button on a movie. And that one little distinction, a pause versus an end, is everything. I mean, an intermission is supposed to be temporary, right? But on the Korean Peninsula, that intermission has dragged on, becoming this permanent, tense reality that has shaped the lives of millions of people for generations. And this right here is the document at the heart of it all. The Korean Armistice Agreement. It's a military agreement, and look at the wording here. It's meant to ensure a complete cessation of hostilities until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. That one word, until, is the whole story. It tells you this was never, ever meant to be the final word on the matter. But you might think, okay, they just signed a ceasefire. Well, getting even to this temporary truce was an absolute nightmare. The negotiations took 2 full years. It was a marathon of back and forth that was honestly just as much of a battle as the one happening on the front lines. So, why was it so hard? Well, a huge part of the problem was that the people actually doing the fighting on the ground, North and South Korea, had totally different goals from their big international backers. On one side, you had Syngman Rhee of South Korea and Kim Il-sung of North Korea. What did they want? Total victory. One unified Korea under their rule. But what about the UN command and China? They had a much simpler goal. Just stop the fighting somewhere around the 38th parallel. And just look at this timeline. It really shows you what a slog this was. The truce talks start way back in July 1951, but the war keeps raging for 2 more years. The talks move from Kaesung to Panmunjom, they hit roadblock after roadblock, and then a huge thing happens. Stalin dies in March of 53, which kind of shakes everything up and helps get things moving again. But through all this, there was one giant issue that just kept derailing everything. So what was that biggest obstacle? It all came down to the fate of over 150,000 prisoners of war. This one issue literally ground the negotiations to a halt for months and months. The UN command was holding all these North Korean and Chinese prisoners, and the big, thorny question was, what do we do with them once the shooting stops? And here's where it got really complicated. Over 22,000 of them, more than 22,000 prisoners, flat out refused to be sent back. They did not want to go home. Now, you can imagine, for China and North Korea, this was a huge PR disaster, a massive embarrassment they just couldn't stomach. On the other hand, for the UN side, the idea of forcing tens of thousands of people to go back against their will was just unthinkable. So you had a total stalemate, a moral and political dead end. Okay, so after 2 long years, and with the political landscape shifting after Stalin's death, the negotiators finally hammered out a deal. So what was actually in it? All right, so the key outcomes of the armistice basically came down to a few major points. First, and most obviously, a complete ceasefire. All guns go silent. Second, it created a new border, the Military Demarcation Line, or MDL, and to keep the 2 sides apart, they set up a 4-kilometer or about 2.5-mile wide buffer zone, what we now all know as the DMZ. And finally, they formed a special commission to deal with that whole POW repatriation mess. Now, this part is absolutely critical. Take a look at who actually signed this thing. On one side, you have General William K. Harrison Jr. for the United Nations Command. On the other, you have General Nam Il for the Korean People's Army and General Peng Dehuai for the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. See the pattern? These are all generals. This was a military agreement to stop the shooting. It was not a political peace treaty between governments. But look closely. Really look at that list. Who is missing? You've got the UN Command. You've got the Korean People's Army, that's North Korea. You've got the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Who is not on that list? South Korea. And that right there is the massive detail that has defined this whole situation ever since. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, never signed the armistice. Its president at the time, Syngman Rhee, absolutely refused. Why?
because he would not accept a divided Korea. He wanted to keep fighting for a total victory. Just let that sink in for a second. One of the main combatants in the war isn't even a signatory to the ceasefire.
So that brings us to the legacy of this whole thing. A ceasefire, but definitely not peace. That missing signature, that refusal to sign, it had huge consequences. You have an agreement that was only supposed to be temporary, and on top of that, one of the main players rejected it. What does that get you? Not peace. It gets you a permanent state of unresolved, simmering conflict.
And let's go back to that key phrase from the agreement itself, from Article 4, Paragraph 60. Until a final, peaceful settlement is achieved. The document itself had a plan. It called for a political conference to be held within a few months to finally work out that final, peaceful settlement.
But it just never happened. They held a conference in Geneva in 1954 to try and work it out, but it went nowhere. It completely failed. And so that temporary ceasefire just became the way things are, an indefinite status quo. The war was never, ever formally ended. In that temporary little buffer zone, the DMZ, well, it's now one of the most heavily fortified, most dangerous borders on the entire planet. We're talking minefields, electric fences, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers staring each other down on hair-trigger alert 24/7. It is the perfect, terrifying symbol of this unfinished war.
And let's be real, this truce has been anything but perfect or peaceful. It's been violated constantly. In 1957, the U.S. decided to withdraw from a clause that banned new weapons and then brought nuclear arms onto the peninsula. Between 1994 and 2013, North Korea announced it was pulling out of the armistice at least 6 different times. And as recently as 2011, South Korea reported over 200 violations by the North in a single year. The ceasefire has been incredibly fragile.
But here's the thing. Despite all the tension, despite all the violations, there have been these recent, incredibly fragile attempts to build a real, lasting peace. That original goal from 1953, it hasn't been completely forgotten. And the biggest of these, by far, was the Panmunjom Declaration, back in April of 2018. This was huge. The leaders of North and South Korea actually met and signed an agreement committing to finally, formally end the Korean War and convert the armistice into a real peace treaty. It was a truly historic moment that brought that 70-year-old goal right back to the forefront. So that's where we're left. The armistice was always just a military stopgap measure, right? It was designed to stop the killing, but it was never, ever meant to be the final solution. So after more than 70 years of living on a razor's edge, can they finally write the last chapter and bring this war to an official end? For now, that's the big question.